Now, for our speaker. She has been a hospice volunteer for 12 years, exclusively on hospice inpatient unit. She is also an end-of-life educator and works in private practice as an end-of-life doula. And she is the founder of the Death Café Easton. So please welcome Jan McGinley.
While we're waiting, I should announce to you that the restrooms are up 8 steps, past the elevators and to the right.
But there's one here, and make sure you hold it like that.
Like this. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay, so you heard the sobering statistic. 10 out of 10, every 10 people are going to die. So we got the bad news out of the way first. I'm glad you invited me here today. My friends are sick of me talking about death and dying and the Death Cafe and my patients. So I'm excited to have an entirely new group to depress today. You have to admit, though, it's not every day or any day that people just sit around and say, let's talk about death and dying. What do you say? I mean, it's a good time, right? So anyway, I'm going to talk to you about my journey as a hospice volunteer, an end-of-life doula, the founder of the Death Cafe, and my role as an end-of-life educator. But first, I would like to talk to you about life, death, grief, and funerals and customs. Then I'll tell you how I got here, because it was a really long and circuitous journey. And in a million years, I never thought that I would end up tending to the dying and finding that that was my purpose in life. So my first experience with grief and death was when I was 10 years old. My grandfather died very suddenly when I was 10. He was the most important person in my life, the person I loved best, and the person I think I was the person he loved best. My parents, my brother and I were taking a trip to Florida, and we were on our way back from Florida, and we were in the car on our way into Washington, D.C. And my brother, who was 8 at the time, started to cry and shake in the back seat. And my mother said, Jimmy, what's wrong? And he said, oh, Mom, something terrible's going to happen to somebody we love. And my mother said, oh, Jimmy, no, don't be ridiculous. That was my mother's favorite phrase. And she said, no, nothing's going to happen. And he said, it is, Mom, something terrible's going to happen. So we pulled into this motel in Washington, D.C. My father called home just to check and see how everything was, and my grandmother informed him that my grandfather had just dropped dead of a massive heart attack about the time that my brother was feeling these things. And he was 65. So when we got home that night, we were put to bed, and nothing was said. I knew that my grandfather had died, but nothing was said about it. And so we were put to bed, and in some far reaches of the house, I heard my father sobbing in such a way that it scared me. And it scared me so much, I literally got out of bed and hid under my bed and slept there for the rest of the night. It was really the scariest feeling I'd had up until that time. So I lost my father, my grandfather. My father was now sobbing, and I didn't know what to think, and I thought, how can anything ever be right again? It seemed like my whole world had just been swept out from under me. At the viewing, I sat in a corner by myself, thinking that no one there understood the level of grief that I felt. I was just a little girl. How could I possibly be as upset as the adults were? I had been told that my pop-pop died, and he was in heaven, and I found that to be of no comfort whatsoever. It didn't matter where he was gone from me, and I was heartbroken. So I didn't care where he was, I just wanted him to come back and get me so I could go with him. So I sat quietly with my fear and my grief, and I didn't bother anyone. I grew up in a time where the phrase children should be seen and not heard was pretty popular. And that was the expectation. Don't make trouble, don't talk unless you're spoken to, you know. No one talked to me or even considered that I felt horrible grief, as much grief as they did. I didn't cry because that would have been something my parents would have to deal with, and I didn't want to upset them or embarrass them. So a day after the funeral, I found a pair of my grandfather's leather gloves in his car, and I took them to my grandmother thinking that she would be happy to have them. But she dissolved into tears, left the room, and I was admonished that I shouldn't have done that because it upset her. So they kept things to themselves, and I kept my grief to myself, and I hid it there deep inside for many years. Even after the funeral, my parents didn't talk to me about my grandfather's death. No one knew that I cried myself to sleep for months after he died. And so, because death and grief were not discussed, my grief turned to fear, a fear that people might die if I went away again overnight. It doesn't sound logical to us as adults, but to a 10-year-old child, the implication was if I go away, somebody else might die. That lasted for 4 years. I'm embarrassed to say that I could not spend the night away from home until after I was 14 years old. If I went away overnight, even to my other grandparents' house or to a girlfriend's house, I would be fine until it was time to go to bed, and then I would get a panic attack, and I would call my father, and to his credit, he always came and got me. But he never asked me what was wrong or where it came from, or, we never got to the bottom of it, because in the 50s, we never got to the bottom of anything. And some of you who grew up in the 50s along with me can understand that. So as I grew into adulthood, the specter of death, dying, grief, and abandonment followed me there. But deep inside, there was this little whisper once in a while that I would hear, that maybe someday I could help other people so that nobody would ever have to feel that way again. We look at funeral practices in the 50s, and the problem in the 50s and for many years after was that people avoided unpleasant conversations of any kind. The 50s were a time of prosperity, middle-class expansion, good behavior, respect for our elders, and not thinking too much about unpleasant things. And even if you thought about them, you never talked about them. Funerals were shrouded in mystery, pageantry, and religious fairy tales. People saw that as a comfort. We were able to avoid dealing with the reality directly of these situations due to the existence of professionals in the funeral industry who handled our dead and our dying for us. Many people died in hospitals in those days, and at that point in time, when you died in a hospital, you were just whisked away to a funeral home. There was no hospice movement, no education about death and dying. There was simply a black hole that you fell into and had to crawl back out of by yourself. There was really no professional support in those days for any kind of grief. When you look at other cultures and earlier times in our history, funeral customs were much different and much more human. The Native Americans, in many cases, placed their deceased on scaffolds out in the middle of a field. And they would wrap them up off the ground, maybe 10 feet off the ground. They would wrap them in a buffalo blanket, and they would let them there for 1 to 2 years so that they could decompose and become grass seed. And then the buffalo would feed on the grass, and then the Indians would then consume the buffalo. And that, for them, was completing the circle of life. I think that makes I think that's beautiful. So I think that that's a part of our funeral and death industry that we're completely missing. When I worked in Brazil, in a little village called Nova Fribogo, there was a little shop that had, all it was caskets. It was just caskets standing up around the walls, all the way around this little building. And when somebody in the village died, the family went and purchased a casket. They washed the body, they dressed the body, they dug a hole, and they buried the body. So one day, I went into the village. I was working at a plant up there. And this guy said to me, "Oh, there's a funeral going by. Let's get in the back of all the group of people." He goes, "You're going to love this." I'm like, "Really?" He said, "Yeah." So we followed the group of people, and people were crying and sobbing and wailing and this and that and the other thing, and they lowered the casket into the ground. And I saw one woman literally jump into the grave on top of the casket, 6 feet down. And I was so shocked. It was the most alarming thing I had ever seen, because you don't see grief like that in this country. That's just not acceptable. Yet this is how most cultures allow their bereaved to behave if they need to or if they want to. But not so in Western culture. We like to think we're much more civilized than that. But who is more civilized? The culture that encourages their mourners to mourn in any way they need to, or the society that forces us to behave in ways that are totally contrary to what we're feeling? Pushing sorrow to the back of our minds and then dealing with it later in private, I personally feel that kind of suppression of grief is barbaric and causes everyone unnecessary pain. So I'm glad that there are advances being made in the support of people who are grieving and going through a death and dying. Embalming, which was invented during the Civil War, changed a lot of things for American deaths, because soldiers had to be shipped home, and it could take days or weeks to accomplish that. So embalming became a necessity and allowed funerals to change. By the 1920s, in rural America, most poor families still buried their dead, laying them out on their dining room table and dressing them and washing them and burying them because they couldn't afford any other alternatives. And at that point in time, most funeral homes were only in big cities and not in small rural areas. Some wealthier families and certain ethnic groups, especially the Irish, who happen to be my people, crazy though they are, held large wakes which lasted for a couple of days. If the bodies weren't embalmed, they had large troughs of ice that they would place under the caskets to keep the body from decomposing too quickly. There was a lot of crying and singing, a lot of drinking, storytelling and toasting, and apparently even practical jokes were played, and many involving the body of the deceased. When I read that, I stopped researching it, so I don't know what happened. I don't know what kind of practical jokes they played with the body, and I don't think any of us need to know that. So Irish wakes in Ireland even had professional mourners called keeners who would wail. There's a specific kind of wailing that they would do that would be representative of the grief that all the mourners felt, but these people were hired to keen. Most of these events took place in people's homes, relatives' homes, or even in drinking establishments, and needless to say, the church frowned upon all of that. In any event, no matter what the circumstances, people were still much more involved with the death and the ceremony surrounding death and were allowed to display their grief. Now, in mid-20th century, we didn't even really need any contact with the dead person. After death, the deceased was whisked away, and morticians dressed, coiffed, and made up the corpse to resemble as closely as possible the deceased during life. In my experience, they usually fail at that. And it can be horrendous. I think it's ghoulish sometimes what's done to somebody's body after death. And people file slowly into the funeral home and stand in line viewing the body in hushed tones, speaking their condolences to the bereaved. There could be soft crying, but definitely no sobbing. It just wasn't done. The next day there would be a church service and maybe a trip to the cemetery in a long black Cadillac, and a graveside service that featured either sod or astroturf so that no one would be upset by seeing the dirt from a freshly dug grave. God forbid we should have to look at that. Then the casket usually hovered over the grave until the mourners left, so nobody was distressed at the thought of actually seeing it lowered into the ground. I don't know why this surprises me. We're such a country of appearances and materialism, so death can be a little too real for us. And we've spent a lot of time and a lot of money masking the reality of death and dying. How is this in any way dealing with the grief that comes from a death of a loved one? We're encouraged to behave, be silent, be strong, and when it's over, the neighbors bring casseroles. We need to give people permission to fall apart if necessary, to try and deal with their own overwhelming sadness and loss. Because they haven't just lost a person, they've lost the life they had with that person. They've lost the life that they might have had with that person in the future, and a piece of themselves as well. I speak to many families every week on behalf of Lehigh Valley Hospice, and I talk to people who have been married 67 years. And I said, I can't even begin to understand what that kind of grief is like. And they're saying it's like losing half of yourself. It's losing your whole life and half of yourself. So the common thread in my conversation with these people is that the proceedings were a blur. They simply had to get through it. They walked through things not feeling anything. And just now they're starting to realize the life-shattering thing that has happened. And now all the casseroles are gone. And all the calls are gone, and all the visitors are gone, and they're kind of on their own. Their kids have gone back to their lives, and they're left to deal with this thing. And I speak to them so we can assess whether they need grief counseling or not, which we offer free of charge for our families for a year. And you'd be surprised how many people do need it. They weren't prepared for the death or the aftermath. They weren't prepared because there really is no way to prepare, especially if you try to pretend it's not happening and you aren't able to talk about it. We also don't know how to talk to our dying. People are uncomfortable, so they make small talk. I hear it all the time. If there was ever a time to ditch the small talk, it's when somebody is about to leave the planet. I had a young man one time who was visiting his uncle, who was my patient, and his uncle was in his final coma. So he wasn't eating, he wasn't drinking, he was just sleeping. But from my personal experience, I know that they hear everything right up until the time they go. That's the last thing to leave. And so when he came in the room, I said to him, I'll give you some time with your uncle. So I left and walked out. I was walking down the hall, and I heard him yell, Uncle Bob, it's me, Davy. Uncle Bob, you remember how you used to to coach my team, and we won the championship, and then we go for hot dogs, and we go for pizza, and we go. And I listened to this for like 5 minutes, and I thought, oh my God, I've got to say something to him. So I walked back in, and I said to him, could I just talk to you for a second? And he said, sure. So I took him out in the hall, and I said, listen. I said, this is the last time you're going to see your uncle. I said, your Uncle Bob he's not part of the material world anymore. He's trying to let go so that he can leave his body, let go of life. He's dying. He doesn't really care about baseball games and hot dogs. I said, if I were you, what I would just go back in there and say to him is what he meant to you. Because he can hear you. He will hear you. But these other things, he can hear you, but it doesn't really mean anything to him where he is in his dying process right now. So he went back in, and I heard him say, Uncle Bob, I can't thank you enough for all the time that you spent with me, how you took care of me when my dad wasn't around, how you were always there for me, giving me advice and helping me with my schoolwork. He said, I just want to tell you how much I love you and how much I'm going to miss you. And so he came out to me and on the way out, and he said, I just want to tell you how much I appreciate your advice. He said, he goes, you don't know what to say to people when they're dying. He said, and guys aren't good at telling each other how much they love each other. He said, but I feel now that I said everything that I needed to say to him, and he knows how much I love him. So I want to thank you. So in the end, just say what's in your heart. That's a proper goodbye. Don't waste anybody's time with small talk. Just say what's in your heart. In our culture, it's important for people to have beautiful caskets. The more expensive, the better. At least the funeral directors will try to sell you the most expensive one. I hope there's no funeral directors here. Because we equate how much we spend on a casket and a funeral to how much we love the person who just died. Even though, as we know, there really is no correlation, and many people are seduced into spending money they do not have to show their loved ones exactly how devoted they are. But because of these practices, every year we put enough steel and wood into the ground to rebuild the Golden Gate Bridge. And when we cremate someone using fire, we use enough energy to supply one person for their energy needs for 3 solid days, in addition to releasing soot, mercury vapor, and formaldehyde into the air. So at this point in time when our planet is on fire, people need to start thinking about green alternatives. Water cremation is a gentle process that uses water and alkaline to mimic that natural decomposition. And then the only thing that's left are the bones, and they can be crushed into a small powder. So you get remains, but it hasn't damaged the ecology of the planet in order to do so. Green burials, where someone is unembalmed, wrapped in a shroud, and buried in a green space, where decomposition can occur naturally and our bodies once again become part of the circle of life. Our funeral practices need to be modified in order to protect the planet. I'd like to read you a passage by Ram Dass from his book called Embracing Aging, Changing, and Dying. Although the work of such pioneers as Cecily Saunders, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, Stephen and Andrea Levine in their work with death and dying have done a great deal to enlighten us in this area, we remain a society in which death is still viewed as the enemy, an onerous thing to be hidden or shunned and separated physically and philosophically as much as possible from the living. How else would a materialistic culture view death of our material being except as an abomination and a defeat? This denial of death, to quote the title of Ernest Becker's groundbreaking book, permits a phobic atmosphere surrounding the issue of our own mortality. Making death taboo gives rise to a certain fascination with the subject. We see this clearly in the culture's fascination with violence and its preoccupation with topics such as euthanasia, suicide, casualties of street crime. Like anything we seek to repress, the fear of death holds a particular insidious power over our culture. Underneath our youth-conscious, death-denying veneer, we are in fact more morbid than societies in which death is confronted more openly. This is why I spend time talking and educating those I meet about death. In order to process anything, we must confront it, bring it into the mainstream conversation, and find a way to deal with it. Okay. Although I didn't recognize it at the time, I became a doula 23 years ago when my mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. I spent 4 months with her, caring for her 24/7, comforting her, taking her to medical appointments, and in the end, becoming her mother while she became my child. I knew she needed me, and I had to find ways to keep her from spinning out of control in fear. At that point in time, I had never even heard the term doula. I didn't have much time with her. She was diagnosed and died in 3 months, but I know I made a difference in her life at that point in time. The morning she died, I suddenly knew exactly what I needed to do. My brother was on the phone 5 minutes after she died, calling the funeral home, and I told him to hang the phone up. I said no. I called her sister and her best friend, and I had them come over, and for the next 2 hours, we sat with my mother. I washed her body, talked to her, we talked about her. I held her hand, and I was able to slowly and gently say goodbye to the body that brought me into the world and held and comforted me for so many years. Her physical body, even without consciousness, was loved by me, and I needed time to let her go. I think it was one of the best decisions I ever made, and I would encourage all of you to think about doing the same when you lose a loved one. You need time to say a proper goodbye to the body, even though the person is not in it anymore. The night after her funeral, I was cleaning out her desk, and stuck in the bottom of a drawer, right where the front of the drawer meets the bottom of the drawer, I found a note. It was a thank you note written to me by my mother, but it was unfinished. I showed it to my brother, and I told him I was happy to have it, even though it was unfinished, because she told me how much I'd helped her and how grateful she was that she had me with her during that time. The next night I came back, and I wandered into the kitchen and over to the desk, and there on the top of the desk was a note in my mother's handwriting. It was a finished note. Can I explain this? Absolutely not. Does it matter that I can't explain it? No. We don't know everything, and I'm okay with that. But that is one of the most extraordinary things that's ever happened to me. But I will say that I would be a fool after spending years sitting with the dying, talking to them and seeing what I've seen, to not believe there is something beyond this plane of existence. I have no idea what that might be. Energy, I have no idea. But if any of you are interested in this topic, there's a great series on Netflix called Surviving Death. And it's very scientific. There's doctors and scientists involved. They're researching near-death experiences, end-of-life visions, mediumship. So it's something great. If the subject of any of these things interests you, I suggest that you definitely take a look at that. I would like to share with you a message that I got from my mother a year after she died. Every night after she died, I would close my eyes and I would have this vision of her dying or seeing her dead. And one night I was in a hotel in Atlanta on business, and I turned off the lights and I closed my eyes. And of course I saw her, her face. And suddenly I heard the words, "Jan, stop focusing on my illness and my death. It was such a small part of my life." And I shot up out of bed, and these words just kept coming to me. And I can't explain it except to say that when you're generating words in your own head. And when you hear something coming from somebody else. It wasn't necessarily her voice. I just heard words. So I ran over to the desk. I got a little pad, the little notepad that they have on the desks in hotels. And I started writing the words I heard in my head. And this is what I heard. "Jan, try to stop focusing on my illness and my death. It was such a small part of my life. Try to focus on all the good memories. I know you remember the problems we had, but we did have good times, lots of them. I only remember the love. It's all we take to this place. You can't do that yet because you're still in the world and your vision is clouded. Your vision and memory are clouded by earthly perceptions. When you come here, all those distractions disappear and you only remember the love you shared. I know you don't believe I'm talking to you right now. You think these words are your own thoughts. But that's because you don't truly believe in your heart that there is a place where we all meet again after this life is over. That's why you're confused when I talk to you. Your heart knows it's me, but it doesn't make sense to your mind. Listen to your heart. Listen to my voice. I'm always with you. We all are. Our love for you is stronger than ever because that is all there is. There is nothing else here but love and the beauty that love creates. Honey, please don't cry. I don't want to make you unhappy, and I don't want to scare you. You've got a good life. Enjoy it. Savor it. Every precious moment of it. Don't let anything rob you of your joy. I know you now. I see who you really are. And I know you always wanted that. I'm so sorry it took me so long. You haven't lost me or Daddy. You have everything now. You have, but most of all, you have love in your life. Let it wash over you. Your love for them, your love for beauty and life, our love for you. Wrap yourself up in all the love. It makes all the things of the world bearable. Give it, accept it, always keep it in your heart, because love is everything and all there is. I'd like to read a quote from Ram Dass again. Every attempt to describe what happens after we die, the bardos in the Tibetan texts, the mansions of the Kabbalah, the heaven and hell of Christianity, all point to the same thing, and that is a realm that the soul enters after death. Though we cannot capture the after-death experience in language, we can point convincingly toward the fact that some form of afterlife does exist. The mind cannot know what is beyond the mind, and death is the dividing line between these levels of reality. If karma and reincarnation truly exist, do we live more conscientiously now, aware that our actions will affect our rebirth? Or do we become complacent, thinking we have eons ahead of us to work out our issues and lifetimes in which to achieve our goals? Everyone needs to decide that for themselves. A few years after my mother's death, I was standing in the middle of a department store, and I thought, oh, I have to call hospice. These things just happened to me. I was in a temple in Thailand one time, and I was standing looking at a Buddha in this huge temple, and all of a sudden I was compelled to just lie prostrate on the floor. And it was the most embarrassing thought, because I thought, why do I feel compelled to do this? But I did it. And then when I got up again, I kind of looked around to see if anybody was looking at me, and I realized everybody down this row was doing the same thing. So I was compelled to do something that I had no thought of doing. But when I have these compulsions and I act on them, it always seems to be the right thing to do for me. So the minute I had the thought that I needed to call hospice, I did. And that was the beginning of this part of my journey. Eventually, everything else that I was doing over the past 12 years, my marriage, my other profession that I had done my whole life, everything fell away. I didn't push it away, it just fell away. And I saw very clearly that this is what I needed to do with the rest of my life. So I've spent 12 years working on the inpatient hospice unit at Lehigh Valley, and it's changed me in ways I cannot even begin to explain. I see it as one of the greatest blessings that's ever come my way. At first, when I sat with the dying, I felt deep sadness for them. They were leaving this life, and those who loved them going to who knows where, or nowhere at all, but they were leaving. And I love this life. I can't think of anything more wonderful and more beautiful than this earth. It's filled with so much beauty and wonder, and I felt sad that their lives were ending. As the years passed, and I was with hundreds of people when they died, I began to realize that I was present at a deeply intimate moment. The most intimate moments are when you are brought into this world and when you leave this world, and it's a privilege to be with somebody when they leave. At the moment when life ends, I felt privileged to be with them. Especially, I didn't know them, but it also helped me to realize that we are all part of something bigger. We're all a drop in the ocean. Of course, the Buddha would say we are the ocean, and that, I understand that, but we are all the same. I felt love for them as human beings, even I didn't know them. And to me, that was extraordinary. I needed to do what I could do to make sure their passing was peaceful and meaningful, if that was possible. Because in a sense, I was them and they were me. Just like I am you and you are me. We're all in this together. We're all humans, all the same. And it was never made clearer to me than when I sat with those who were dying. You take away someone's personality, and what do you have left? You just have a human body with a soul who's just like you, who's suffered just like you have, who's been happy just like you have. We all share the same experiences on this planet. And then, at some point, I actually began to be happy for them, especially the older patients who had lived long lives, leaving family and friends and accomplishments and wonderful stories as their legacy. They led well-lived lives. That, to me, is the circle of life. It seemed, it's not the end of the world. It's just the end of our life here, the end of us. If nothing was finite, why would any of this even matter? The fact that there is an end to what is makes all of it so precious. And finally, it seemed natural. I saw the symmetry that all living things must die, and I was able to welcome it with them. My fear of death was finally gone, and it only took 60 years of hard work. 2 years ago, I decided my next step was to become an end-of-life doula. Doula comes from the Greek word meaning servant of women, and doulas have been around for thousands of years helping women give birth to their children. End-of-life doulas are relatively new. The profession started about 15 or 20 years ago as the rise in hospice popularity came about. More people want to die at home, not in hospitals. And baby boomers are now dying in such large numbers that they're filling hospitals, nursing homes, and hospices in record numbers. And because there are so many of us, these facilities are not able to accommodate everyone. So with the help of hospice care, many are afforded the luxury of dying in their own beds at home. The popularity of doulas rises in direct proportion to how dissatisfied people are with end-of-life care. The end of someone's life seems an unusual time for a doula to join a family as a companion. But people at the end of their life, both the dying and their families, need support to navigate this last part of the journey. Doulas can help with legacy work, living wills, medical directives, and projects such as family history or letters to leave for loved ones. We sit vigil with the dying during the entire process, and we're able to help the family identify physical symptoms and what they mean. Because all bodies die in a certain way. If somebody is dying from a slow disease or from old age or whatever, the symptoms are pretty much the same. So we can interpret those symptoms and help people understand that they've got a few days left or a few hours left just by seeing the symptoms that they're presenting at that time. This helps alleviate their fears and help them deal with the process that leads up to dying. We also act as an additional layer of communication and coordination with the hospice team. And we help families navigate this difficult time with relationships and assist with funeral arrangements if they need that, or eulogies, or obituaries. And then when it's over, we continue to work with the family for about 6 weeks as they struggle with their new normal without their loved one in their lives. Becoming an end-of-life doula was not so much a decision for me as it was a need for me. I felt compelled to do this. It seemed as though the last 12 years were preparing me for just this moment. And as I reflect back on those years, I can see how everything else I was doing just fell away to make room for this new path. So I took my training at a place called INELDA, which is the International End-of-Life Doula Association. I became aware of a worldwide network of death cafes while I was taking this training. They're not physical cafes, they're conversations that take place at cafes or small venues. Death cafes were founded by Bernard Crettaz, who was a Swiss sociologist. They were originally called Café Mortel, or death cafes, and were styled as intellectual salons for topics such as funeral customs, death, dying, and grief. John Underwood, a web developer in England, loved the idea and decided to promote it worldwide, which he did. I wanted to join one. And so when I looked around, I Googled Death Cafe. It's an international organization called deathcafe.com. And there's over 15,000 in the world. There's over 8,000 in the United States. But I tried to Google one, and there was none in the local area. The closest one was in Kennett Square or State College. So I decided to start one. So our Death Café in Easton takes place at an art studio that's filled with color and paintings, Tibetan prayer flags, paper lanterns, and a lot of really good energy. Death cafes are conversations about all aspects of death and dying, including death with dignity, green burials, grief. Our last meeting, we discussed psychedelics as end-of-life therapeutics, and anything else people might want to talk about. I only allow 8 people in each conversation because we want it to be a conversation, not a meeting. So we have no specific agenda or format that we follow. I just talk a little bit about the Death Cafe for people who don't know about it, and then we throw out a question, and then we're off and running. We've asked questions such as, is there anything after this life? What is the perfect death you would craft for yourself if you had the opportunity? Almost anything related to death and dying is a great topic, and we have wonderful discussions. And perhaps somewhat surprisingly, there's some laughter too. So death cafes are free to attend. The only rule is that when we talk about death, we must do it over tea and cake. Because the British, that's the way they like to do things, and it's always best to have an uncomfortable conversation with sweets. We have an afternoon meeting on the third Wednesday of the month and an evening meeting on the fourth Tuesday for people who can't come during the day. We talk about death because it helps us realize how precious our life is, and the more we talk about it, the less we fear death. If someone told you you would have 6 months to live, how would you choose to spend that time, and with whom? So my advice is to look at each beautiful sunset, laugh with your friends, embrace your children and your grandchildren, savor each wonderful meal, and be mindful and grateful for every moment because it is going to end and we never know when. I'd like to share this one observation by Alan Watts. It says, the more a thing tends to be permanent, the more it tends to be lifeless. Without birth and death and without perpetual transmutation of all the forms of life, the world would be static, rhythmless, undancing, and mummified. And I believe that with my whole heart. I've used the knowledge of my certain death to help find more meaning in my life. And I think death is our lifelong companion and can be our greatest teacher if we allow it. Plato said, death is nothing more than a migration of the soul from this place to another. Ralph Waldo Emerson says, do you see, oh my brothers and sisters, it is not chaos and death, it is form and union and plan. It is eternal life. Carl Jung, after his heart attack in 1944, said, what happens after death is so unspeakably glorious that our imaginations and our feelings do not suffice to form even an approximate conception of it. Goethe said, I am just as certain as you see me here now, that I have existed 1,000 times before, and I hope to return 1,000 times more. I'm not going to lie to you, I don't know what happens after we die, any more than anyone else does. I have my thoughts. But obviously, there's no empirical evidence to support anybody's theory, so I think you should go with whatever comforts you the most, regardless of what it is. I just look forward to the great adventure when it comes, as long as it doesn't come too soon. In closing, I would just like to say that this journey called life has been a wild ride, which I think is the case for all of us. We need to be willing to get on the ride with our whole hearts and minds, to experience everything there is, good and bad, tragic and magnificent, darkness and light, pain and love, and find a way to embrace it all. Let go of the way we think should be, and just learn to swim in the stream of life as it comes to us. That's what makes life life. We're all here to experience it all, and I believe that whatever comes next, even if it's nothing, all of this is still worth the trip. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? I'd ask you to speak into the microphone if you do.
I can just talk loud.
Well, it's for the recording.
Hi. I don't know that I have a question, but I just wanted to comment that with my job, I work with seniors at a retirement community, and I also, before that, did home helper with older people. And the conversation of death comes up all the time. Certain patients I have, it's every visit. And a lot of the frustration is that they do not feel like they can talk to their family. There's no communication with their family, and they're telling me what they are hoping for and what they wish, and then you also hear their family is talking to the staff about the management, about their concerns, and there's just this big void in between them. And you know, as a occupational therapist, that's not my role, so I have to tread very carefully, but I do what I can to try to encourage them to have a conversation.
Most of the time as a doula, I spend most of my time talking to the family about trying to go with the patient's wishes, because their wishes are, the dying person's wishes are often very much in counterpoint to the family's wishes. And, you know, this happens on the hospice unit all the time too. People are like, can't we give them fluids? No. Why would we want to do that? They're on their way. You know, we need to keep this going and keep it, you know, keep movement toward the goal here, which is for them to leave their body.
Yeah. Some of them are even just afraid. Some of the families are afraid. They don't even feel like they're supposed to ask their loved one what they want. Like they're afraid that if they bring it up, that somehow they're letting them think that their parent will think that they're wishing that they die, because they feel like, you know, there's that struggle of I'm a burden, oh my, and the family knows that, no, you're not a burden. But so if I start talking about you dying, then you're going to think I want you to be gone faster.
The
It's really tricky.
the family dynamic is the most complicated thing about the dying situation.
Okay, we had a nurse here from Trenton, I believe she was, who ended up in jail because she gave her father the morphine and he took the morphine. How do you feel about morphine?
Well, the prevailing wisdom for a lot of people is that hospice kills people. That hospice kills people with morphine, with Ativan, that sort of thing. No. What happens when a patient is in hospice is we use morphine and Valium or any kind of an anti-anxiety just to treat pain and anxiety. Does it sometimes speed up? Sometimes it just lets a person relax, so they're not fighting it, they're not anxious, they're not in pain. So it lets the body relax, so the body can do what the body is trying to do.
Would your hospice prevent somebody from taking? Would your hospice prevent somebody from taking an extra dose of morphine because, okay, I've lived my life, I'm done, this is it?
No, they probably wouldn't. I mean, they would. It's
Don't go.
No. The hospice unit at Lehigh Valley, the inpatient unit, they're constantly monitoring the medications of the patients. If somebody needs more morphine to get them to a place where they're comfortable, they will give them more morphine. If somebody just says, can I have some more morphine, and they're non-symptomatic, they're not suffering from pain, nobody's going to give them more morphine. But they treat the symptoms. And in treating the symptoms, it allows the person to at least pass. Do they maybe pass a couple of hours more quickly? Maybe. But the important thing is that they're pain-free and they're anxiety-free. That's the important thing. But hospice will not overdose anybody. No, they will not. And doctors, and if a doctor does, they'll never admit it. So, I mean, if you have a doctor in your family, I know when my grandmother was dying, my cousin was a doctor, and we begged him to give her a little something. I think they had opium suppositories at that time.
A lot of times they won't because
And-
they don't want to addict the patient.
Well, they're so afraid of getting in trouble, and I can't blame them. This woman, I was just reading an article about her the other day. In fact, I posted it on the Death Café Facebook page. She sat with her mother. Her mother took an overdose of something, sleeping pills or whatever, and she sat with her while she was dying. And she was arrested and taken to the police station for aiding and abetting her mother in her end of life. This is the kind of crap that we have to stop, And now with a lot of death with dignity acts are being passed in a lot of states. People hopefully won't have to fly to Switzerland, pay $15,000 to go to sleep anymore. And everybody has said this, we take better care of our pets at the end of their life than we do our people. And I think that's an abomination to me. I think everybody has the right to a good death. We all have to die. Let's make it as good as possible. I think that's our job. That's our responsibility.
Any other questions?
We actually signed up for Life Quest, which is basically, we have a card we've given to our daughter, and she can call this number. They will come and collect us. And I think it's New York Hospital, one of the medical schools. And then, we're used as cadavers or whatever. And then at the end, when they're done, there's cremation. And my daughter can take our remains or not. She doesn't have to. I'm wondering if you have any experience with this type of thing. And also, I just want to put out there that when, I was really happy and proud when I did this, that I would kind of take all the pain out of my daughter's hands, here, call this number, it'll be done, And she actually was rather alarmed by it. And so I'm wondering if we're actually doing the right thing by her by doing this. But, I, on the other hand, feel very strongly about it.
Well, it's your life and it's your body. I mean, I think you should be able to do with it what you want, and your daughter can get on board or not get on board, but I think that she has I mean, I did things for my mother as my mother wanted them done when she was living. And she wanted to be buried and, do the whole funeral thing, and so we did that. But I think that the fact that you've made your wishes known to your daughter knows what your wishes are, and the more you talk about it over time, the more she'll become, okay with the fact that this is what you want. But yeah, I think if you think that's what you really want to do, then you're doing the right thing. And she needs to do the right thing and support your decision, as you would support her decision, I'm sure, if she had, a difficult decision like that to make.
Do you have any experience with this sort of thing? Are there any downsides to it?
I've never had a patient that's chosen.
That's what my father and mother signed up for. My father went through that, and it was, I would say, very positive. I can tell you more
Oh, okay.
later. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I've never had a patient that's chosen that.
With the downside, my parents chose cremation, and there's 5 kids in my family, and my one sister still has a real hard time with the idea of visualizing their bodies inflamed. So she still struggles with it deeply. That is what they wanted, but I think I've told them that I'm interested in natural burial, and she seems to be more comfortable with that. I'm not doing it for her sake. I mean, I believe in it, but she's not. But so far, she has not had any more fears. It was, I think, the fire. The idea of the fire was really frightening for her.
Well, then maybe you should consider water cremation. It's more gentle.
So I know that the Death Café, you ask the question and they talk about generally death. Is there anything for people who are grieving?
Well, we have people that are grieving in our group. It's not specifically a group for grievers, but it's a group to talk about death, dying, grief, fear, all of the things that are wrapped up with that. We do have somebody in the group that after the first time she came, I recommended that she see a grief counselor, in addition to continuing to come to the Death Café. So, because that's what I do most of the time, I assess people for whether or not they need grief counseling, when I call on behalf of hospice. But yeah, we talk about grief. I post things on the Facebook page about grief and dying and death and everything. So there's lots of articles for people to read. But if somebody needs very one-on-one grief counseling, then I refer them to that. But they're still welcome to come to the Death Café. I do have some reprints here of the morning call article that they did on the Death Café in Easton. If anybody wants one, you can have one to learn a little bit more about it and how to get in touch with us if you want to come to a conversation.
Yeah, it has a lot of information in that article. So, Jim?
So I got sort of an unusual question. My wife and I are pretty well aligned around humanism, though my wife is still a member of a church and still attends Zoom, doesn't believe in God and realizes the truth of the situation. And we've discussed dying and whatever. And my opinion is, and I'd like to hear your opinion about this, my opinion is that the person dying can make requests, but the survivors make the decisions. So the dilemma specifically I have is I don't want to go to a church, have a priest, a pastor come by. I've made the point that I want a human celebrant to take care of my funeral. But I really think if I'm gone, the survivors probably ought to have the right to operate the funeral in any way they want. And the reverse of that is my wife, who is socially still a church person, doesn't go to church anymore, but is still socialized that way. She might very well end up with a human celebrant at her funeral because that's what I want, and that she might not want. Any thoughts on that?
I'm very much in favor of a person being able to make decisions about their own body. As a woman who grew up in the 60s, one of my friends died because she didn't have access to a legal abortion. And she tried to abort herself in our college dorm with a knitting needle, and she bled out because nobody was around, and she died. So I'm very much into your autonomy. I think that the people that love you need to love you enough and respect you enough to respect your wishes, whatever they are. I don't think it's a time for them to be selfish and go, hey, I know that I know that Bob doesn't want a funeral, but, I really want Bob to have a funeral. Well, if you really loved Bob, you'd give Bob the funeral that he wanted. That's my attitude. Might not be very popular, but I'm very much into people being able to make their own decisions, and the people that love them should respect those decisions. So, that's just me.
Thank you for this. I think this needs to be done, so thanks for coming to our group. I've actually helped facilitate 2 death cafes when I was living up in Connecticut with a humanist group. Has anybody here done a death cafe? All right, well, they're awesome. And I was one of the boo-hooers that was like, ugh, that sounds terrible. And I went home, I was like, this is the greatest thing ever, and we did a second one because it was so popular. And we had people driving like fairly long distances when they heard about it. And it's really a relief that everybody sits down like, okay, here we go, and it's like, what do you think happens when you die? That's just one half of it, and then dealing with other people's deaths is a big piece of it, but it turns out to be very energizing and really empowering, and I'm a big fan, so I think we should just do our own. I really do. I mean, it really is awesome. So I guess nobody else has done it. Yeah. Okay.
Anyone else? Questions, comments?
You may have partially answered this already, but I'm dealing with a hospice chaplain right now. And of course, I'm struggling with life after life. Is there truly a spirit? Does it go somewhere? And the hospice chaplain, of course, follows the Bible. Mm-hmm. But I've spent hours on the internet trying to look at every different religion and what they say after death. And I'm still trying to figure that out. You're told as a child, like, oh, your grandmother is up there with your grandfather and are having a really good time now. So you should be really happy. And I told the chaplain, I think that's bullshit because I'm not sure that that's what happens. Mm-hmm. And then, I read Dr. Moody's book on the near-death experiences. And I think the best answer I saw from a doctor on the internet was, the bottom line is we really don't know. But I just, from all your work, and I probably need a grief counselor here in the Lehigh Valley, but what's your take on it? I'm struggling and have spent hours on the internet reading.
I'll tell you, I was raised Catholic. I hated every minute of it. And so
We understand.
there's nobody more anti-religion than me, okay? But I will say, with all the experiences I've had with dying people, my own mother included, one of the very common events, maybe up to 40% of all the people that I sit with who die, have people that come for them. They see people, their parents, their aunts and uncles, whatever, and they have these conversations with them. And when this first happened to me, I'm like, who's she talking to? And then I realized she saw people, and this happens in so many cases. They start coming days before, maybe a week before. First they start dreaming about them. Then they start coming to visit. And I can't tell you what that means, but I know it gives the people who are dying great comfort. And I mean, this letter from my mother, I never expected that. I called my husband on the phone right after I transcribed all this and I read it, and I was sobbing because I told him I thought I was having some kind of a psychotic episode or something, that I felt like I was crazy. Where did this come from? I hate to even say this, I wasn't even going to get into this, but I've had many visitations in many ways from many people. It's something called automatic writing. So I hear words. I know who it is by just knowing what they're saying. I have never had anything come from anybody that I don't know, but I've had messages from people that I do know, and I just write down what they're saying. And, I believe there's something. I don't know what it is, But I believe in some way, if it's our energy, if we all go into, I don't believe that God sits up there in a big, throne and goes, you are getting cancer. You are going to die tomorrow. I don't believe any of that. I don't believe that God cures people, and I don't believe that God kills people. I think that what happens to us, that we're created somehow by some being or something, and we're put here to live out this life, and what happens to us while we're here is a crapshoot. It's just life. The good stuff, the bad stuff, the horrible stuff, the wonderful stuff, the amazing stuff. That's what I believe. And this hasn't come to me. I didn't sit down one day and decide to believe this. This is just an accumulation of 74 years of experience on this planet and the things that have happened to me. And many of the things that have happened to me have all made me feel like I was crazy sometimes because I wasn't looking for them and I didn't expect them and I didn't know what to make of them. I just don't think we can understand at our level of being. I think our minds are too small to understand and grasp the concept of lots of things that we don't know anything about. I just think that we're very limited from our perspective here on this planet in these bodies.
I would just like to say, slightly different perspective, with all due respect, but and I'm mostly thinking about what you were talking about. I'm still a recovering Catholic after almost 77 years, and all of that stuff, the thing that has given me complete peace is the fact that I recognize that I am an atheist. And that has given me such complete peace, and an understanding is, you live, you die. That's pretty much what it is. And I think the idea of having people around you when you are dying and comforting you, that's wonderful. But I'm really uncomfortable with all the other stuff that's gotten added on. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in the soul. I don't believe in automatic writing. I don't believe in any of it. But that has given me a complete peace. And I did it through reading and reading and reading and letting go of all the garbage that had been piled on me in my life. That was how I...
Well, that's what I said a couple minutes ago. I think you should believe whatever brings you the most comfort. Whatever helps you get through this life, whatever it is, you should go with it. Because, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, anyone last questions? Sure, no problem.
Thank you for this excellent talk and for your work.
Thank you.
And this has been very helpful. You talked about the complexity of the family dynamics, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how you guide a family to realize the wishes of the person who is dying.
Well, the first thing I do is before I take clients, and I only take one set of clients at a time. I only deal with one family at a time. I don't like juggling people when they're dealing with death. So I have an initial meeting with usually the husband and the wife. It's usually the parents that are involved. And I have an initial meeting with them. What are their goals? What are they trying to accomplish? Say the husband is the one that's dying. What kind of an environment does he want? Who does he want to visit? What are their goals? And so I find out what their goals are. And then I meet with the children separately. And I talk to them and see where they have problems with what their parents want. I'm sort of like a mediator. And then I go back to the parents and I said, okay, I've talked to your kids and this is the consensus and this is the one sticking point, whatever it is. And we try to negotiate. It's like you would negotiate a business deal or something else. We try to negotiate something that works for everybody so that everybody is on board and everybody together. Whatever they decide on, they've decided as a group. And then everybody is on board. They want the same outcome. And some people have to give up a little bit of this or a little bit of that. But it's a negotiation, really. It's just like you try to take the emotion out of it and just say, okay, this one thing is really important to your father. And, he doesn't want visitors. He only wants one visitor at a time or whatever. Well, I want to come and bring my wife and my 3 kids. I said, well, you can do that. But, and so I would talk to him and he'd say, well, I'd like to see my son separately, and then his wife and the 3 kids can come in. Something like that, whatever it is that they want. And so we try to work things out like that.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jan. This was a wonderful discussion.
Thanks.
So, thank